gentlemen.
Can I please have your attention? Daniel
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by The Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I'm very excited, or I was very excited, because I'm recording this intro a few days later because we had technical issues and I was under the gun on a deadline and we had all sorts of other things and I had to get home to make the sauce and I had to drop off the guns at Robert De Niro's house. And if you don't get the reference, watch more movies. But I'm always excited to have Daniel Hannan, my friend from across the pond, a friend of the podcast, friend of the colonies. He is the author of many books. My favorite, or the one I at least rely on the most, is Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. I'd give you a more in-depth recap of everything that we talked about, but this was so long ago and so many drinks ago, it's hard for me to be sure. But we definitely talked about the fact that he was a member of the House of Lords. We talked about the state of free speech in the UK, and we talked about how things are going awry on all sorts of other fronts as well, and did a good bit of English history to boot. So I think people will enjoy it. He's always popular with listeners. And let's just get to it. Are you a lord now?
How about that? Yes. Member of our upper house.
Yeah, well, that's weird, but
cheapest upper house in the world, I think, actually, because we're, and it's a really great model, this. We're not paid anything. So it's kind of a bit like the Texas Assembly or somewhere. You get a tiny stipend for turning up, but nobody does this for a living, with the result that we are sort of citizen legislators. We have to do something in the real world.
Okay, so this is not where I intended to start, but I'm curious. I mean, I know Blair kind of gelded a big chunk of the House of Lords, but like, what is the most concrete power that the upper chamber has?
Delay and amendment. We ultimately can't veto. And although we can initiate, it never really goes anywhere without the government support. But under our system, because we don't have the division of power, if you're the Prime Minister and you have a majority in the Commons, then basically you are guaranteed to win every vote there, or almost every vote there. So the only real opportunity to revise bad legislation, I mean, just on the most basic level, things that have been overlooked or badly drafted, is in the upper house.
The cliche, which goes back to the Federalist Papers in the States, about the Senate being the cooling saucer. A lot of people don't know that, like, the way tea was originally, at least in the Americas, drunk, was like, if the cup of tea was too hot, you poured a little out into the saucer that the teacup came on, and then drank and sort of slurped it out of the teacup, out of the saucer, because it cooled off by being in there. And that was sort of how the founders envisioned the Senate. The House would be the repository of popular passion, and then the Senate would just sort of take that stuff and take the rough edges off it and have a longer time horizon on it. So you still have that kind of function.
Oh, very much so. I mean, sadly, I wish it were otherwise, but I think that story is apocryphal. It was supposed to be Jefferson to Washington, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
But definitely that is the principle of, I would say, of almost every bicameral system, actually, that the necessary radicalism of the popularly elected chamber will be checked by the relative conservatism of one that looks more long-term, or that can be dispassionate because it isn't elected at all, or indeed just contains older people and therefore acts as a slightly more patient check on what may be a transient popular mood.
Also, what often will have longer or lifetime terms, so they don't have to worry about the next election during a populist moment, the way people in the lower chamber do, where it's expected to be higher turnover.
Yeah, and I think that really matters just to put my cards on the table here, Jonah, I'm not a big fan of how we have our current House of Lords constituted. It seems to me crazy just to have half of the legislature appointed effectively by successive executives. But the idea, especially in this age of screen-addled, shrunken attention spans and conspiracy theories and angry online mobs, the idea of having people who are deliberately immune to that and who ultimately can't stop it, but who can just say, hang on, are you sure about this? I think there may be a case for it.
No, that's totally fair. Okay, so I asked my friend Francis Durnley from The Telegraph, who's the last Brit on here, the same question, and I'm just sort of trying to take temperature of people. Speaking of attention-addled, screen-mitigated news consumption or information consumption, the stuff that I get from my various, social media channels, or the stuff that breaks through on conservative media, is that you guys are losing your minds when it comes to free speech stuff. And I'm always a little cautious these days when you hear these tales of woe and sort of apocalyptic pronouncements about the end of civilization and whatnot. But everybody I ever talk to from the UK says, no, it's actually pretty bad. What should Americans know to understand in a better context what is going on with this? Because we see these stories of cops going to people's homes and saying, you said a bad thing on Twitter, and meanwhile, the person who actually did a bad thing, like beat somebody up or killed somebody, doesn't seem to be treated sufficiently harshly, while the person the people who do things literally aren't all that punished, but the people who do things figuratively are. Like, how should we think about it?
Right. Exactly. I mean, if inciting violence is an offense, and I think it is an old common law offense in both your system and ours, then by definition, the actual physical crime that was incited must be worse, right? I mean, I don't see how you can get around that. So I think pretty bad is probably the best way of putting it, not to be boring and sound like all your other British guests, but obviously we're not Iran or Venezuela or Russia. This is still a free society, but there has been, over the last 10 years, an alarming acceleration in the interpretation of often, very old laws that were previously never being used in this way against incitement or in favor of public order. And I think what really upsets people, and this is what crosses, I think, into most US media feeds, is the asymmetry of it. If you're on an anti-Israel march, it's policed in a very soft way, and you can more or less say whatever you like, and free speech applies. But if you are protesting against immigration, then a very different standard applies. So the day that we are recording this, the 21st of August, is the day that a woman called Lucy Collinley just got out of prison, having served more than a year for having tweeted an angry and intemperate post after the Southport murders, saying, I don't care if the effing immigrant hostels are all burned down with the people inside them. She calmed down, walked the dog, came home, deleted it, and then was arrested and unbelievably spent over a year in prison, literally in prison, which was, as you correctly say, more than some of the people involved in the violence did. And that, I think, is... You could argue that this is, an incitement thing, that we've had that law since 1986, whatever. But I don't think it was ever applied like this until very recently.
Okay, so that is the perfect segue. For once, one of my hosting plans is coming together.
Glad to be of service, sir.
I'm increasingly of the mind that you guys really have blown it by not having a written constitution. Let me just give you, and I'll give you like 3 different ways you can take this. A friend of mine recently asked me, he texted me, he was like, hey, I was just wondering, why do you think it is that English conservatives, British conservative philosophers, Scruton, Oakeshott, those guys, don't have more of an audience in the US and among American conservatives? And I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I think part of the explanation is that because English philosophy or English conservatism is grounded in this sort of, everyone assumes that everybody in the conversation is English and shares something of a common culture and tradition and ancestry, even if they come down on different sides of different questions. And so it lends itself, it's more hostile to abstraction, going back to Burke. It's more hostile to sort of rigid rationalist approaches to philosophy and to politics. Oakeshott talks about politics as the crow flies and all that. And I'm much more enamored with sentiment, familiarity, the Tolkien-esque hobbit holes of Little England and that kind of thing. And I love that stuff. And it's one of the reasons why I'm an Anglophile. But as you enter into a modern 21st century, techno-capitalist society with immigration and all these kinds of things, you have less shared common ancestry and vision. And particularly if you're going to be bad at assimilation, I think the Brits are better at assimilation than the French, and I think Americans are better than the Brits at assimilation. It really helps to have the rules written down So you don't have this sort of, let's just do this on instinct and where the zeitgeist is, understanding of what the law and what the rules are. Do you think have half a point, a third of a point?
I've almost nothing to add to that, Jonah. You've exactly encapsulated it. So, Jonah, I think you just brilliantly explained what's wrong with our system. I think there's another difference between the UK and US traditions, which is our relative small c conservatism. The Tory tradition here is more hierarchical and more elitist. The Republican tradition in the US is more populist and more radical. It's the difference between Burke and Jefferson, to take two contemporaries. It's why Tom Paine is seen as a hero by a lot of people who are Republican supporters in the US, but is seen very much as being on the far left and a backer of the French Revolution in the UK. But I would come to the question of constitutional change and a written constitution, I think, in a more practical and down-to-earth way than that. Yes, of course, it's true that we are being challenged by the diversity of society, by the multi-ethnic and multicultural nature of it. Yes, you're right, we are better at assimilation than the French are, but I don't think that's really raising the bar particularly high. But honestly, the whole system has been a mess since the Blair government in the 90s. There are so many asymmetries, so many anomalies and excrescences that now really need to be rationalized. And I would put into that pot the role and composition of the upper house. It is bizarre that people like me are appointed for life. At least when there were hereditary peers, there was a genuinely independent element to the upper house. I would put into it devolution. The governments and the peoples of England, Scotland, and Wales all have slightly different powers, and in a way that, you could say is charming and eccentric and old world, but actually is kind of bad for democracy. I would put into it the role of local government. Very, very much weaker here than in the US, and it makes a huge difference. I am speaking to you from the county of Hampshire. Old Hampshire, England, has about the same population as New Hampshire, but it doesn't control its legal system or its police or its welfare system or its tax system. We are a uniquely weak system when it comes to a weak form of government when it comes to local power. And I'd also put in there the question of the Supreme Court. Blair created this thing called a Supreme Court, which of course, when you call it that, it gets ideas, but there is no constitution for it to interpret. And I think we do now need to look at the division of powers here. The British Prime Minister kind of almost accidentally inherited pretty much intact the powers that used to attach to an 18th century monarch. And given the expansion of government since then, given the sheer number of things that the state does, I think that is becoming quite hard to sustain. And I think there is now an overwhelming rationale for some kind of division of powers that would separate the executive and legislative branches more clearly. Now, I don't think we should rush into this, right? I think we should do it in a very British way, have a royal commission, take our time, explore the alternatives. But I think that some kind of rationalization is now the least bad alternative. And I would hope that that's something that will be done by a Conservative government, so that it will be done in a judicious and measured way. What is it the Book of Common Prayer says about marriage? We should be absolutely reserved and careful about it, and we should steer clear of utopian schemes. We should do it reverently, discreetly, advisedly so.
First of all, just on the Thomas Paine versus Edmund Burke stuff, I'm with you on this. My friend and colleague Yuval Levin, his PhD dissertation, which became one of his books, was called The Great Debate, and it was on the rivalry, the debates between Burke and Paine as really the foundation of modern left and right. I'm very much on Team Burke, and I'm also agree, and I'm not a huge fan of Paine, no matter how you spell it. I don't want to go too deep down the weeds into government reform in the UK, but as tempted as I am to pander to what the masses really want to hear about, but is any of that going to happen? Right? I mean, is this something that this is something we can talk about? I can talk to you at great length about what we need to do to get our financial house in order, or a dozen other things like that. But there's no prospect on the horizon that the UK is going to change, or America is going to reform these things, or that the UK is going to, in the next 5 years have something that looks more like a written constitution or even a more well delineated system of federalism or any of that kind of stuff? Is it something that people are actually talking about, or did I just turn over a rock and find out that you're an enthusiastic supporter of all this stuff?
But certainly more the latter. But then nobody is ever really interested in process, right? People find it very off-putting when people like you and me talk about the structures and the institutions. But obviously, these things do matter a great deal. And honestly, with this Labour government, I don't see anything happening. They've run out of steam already. They're lame duck after 1 year. But so many problems have piled up. I think there is a sotto voce conversation among conservatives about fixing some of these things. It will probably stop short of being called a written constitution. And, in a way, you don't have to have a document called the Constitution to have a distinction between kind of constitutional law and statute law. We've always recognized that, the Bill of Rights, our Bill of Rights, or Magna Carta are slightly separate from normal, from a statute regulating how much noise you're allowed to hear at work or whatever. There's nothing in our system that explicitly makes that distinction, but everyone kind of understands it. And so there are, I think, ways in which you could have a revised Bill of Rights if you didn't want to call it a new constitution.
Yeah, I mean, I find the whole process of trying to come up with that stuff without a written constitution kind of truly weird. I mean, it's one of the more American things about me. Like, as strange as I find the UK system, I can see the rationality in it in terms of how it emanates from its history. The Israeli political system is just the dumbest system of any thriving Western democracy, just in the sense of having one legislative body and a Supreme Court that is, I mean, I was sympathetic to both sides of those fights about the Supreme Court in Israel because their system is just so badly done and really needs to rethink, but that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Well, maybe part of this is to do with context rather than just the exact content of a constitution, right? If we had in front of us now a copy of the Constitution of the USSR or that of East Germany, it would actually, there'd be nothing in it that would leap off the page as outrageous, right? It would be full of promises about free speech and free assembly and free worship and all the rest of it. But of course, as the peoples of those unhappy countries discovered, paper rights mean nothing without an enforcement mechanism. And, in the US and in the UK, there's a culture which lends itself to an enforcement mechanism. I mean, actually, I find Israel much more interesting in this sense, in the sense that a lot of Israelis came from countries where there was no such tradition and lost no time in getting the hang of how a functioning liberal democracy worked and became very sophisticated about how to navigate that complicated voting system and all the rest of it. Another way of approaching it is this. I've always been fascinated by this as somebody who grew up in South America. A lot of the South American republics are celebrating their bicentenaries round about now. Most of them deliberately and consciously downloaded versions of your constitution, which by the 1810s was already seen as a great success. So they went for the separation of power, the three branches of government, the federalism, and all of this. And yet, with maybe one or two exceptions, almost all of those countries have lurched from dictatorship to revolution to more chaos. And so it plainly wasn't just the Constitution that determined these things. There were other things going on. The Constitution had to be embedded in a series of, if you like, non-governmental institutions and social habits. And I think that's something that we tend to overlook when we focus only on how the law is written down.
No, I agree with that entirely. And, the way I think the thing that explains it is that Israel has arguably the strongest and healthiest civil society of any Western democracy. Its fertility rate is going great. Its commitment to the project of its own nation is very strong. Sebastian Junger has some really fascinating stuff about how Israel is one of the only countries that does not have the problem with PTSD of its returning soldiers that other Western countries do, because the disconnect between civil society and public service is so much smaller there than it is in the West. So I think my point is that the civil society is strong, but the written part of it is bonkers and needs to be fixed. I mean, like, as you know, in the United States, if you want to bring a lawsuit to to court, you need to have some injury. You need to have standing. And in Israel, you can just sue based on some abstract offense that you take. And so the Supreme Court takes on cases that has no business taking on. But anyway, this is all a digression. Okay, let's take a break for our sponsor. But before we get to that, I just want to take a little moment as a point of personal privilege and to thank Jamie Weinstein for just really great work here at the Dispatch for the last couple of years. He's a real talent, and he's been doing the sort of first Dispatch podcast of the week, the interview show, for a while now, and he's moving on, and think the world of the guy. And for his last episode, he had his friend and ours, Matt Lewis, on. They talked about a whole bunch of things, and he also had his goodbye from the Dispatch. So I want to say, just once again, thanks to Jamie for all the hard work and the really fantastic content, and hope to work together with him again in the future. I want to get back to the English eggheadery here for a second. So when I started pulling on the threads for my last book about where freedom comes from and all these kinds of things, I was instructed by all sorts of people I trust that I have to get really up to speed on the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution is a thing that really laid the foundations for the American Revolution in terms of the principles and concepts that it laid down, and yada, yada, yada. And I'm down with that. Or I think I'm glad I did the deep dive on the Glorious Revolution. But the funny thing is the more and more I pull on the thread of the Glorious Revolution, you find that a lot of English people say, no, our real revolution was the English Civil War, which came earlier. And the Glorious Revolution, the only reason it was glorious was because it was just basically cleaning up some odds and ends from the English Civil War. And it was glorious because we didn't kill anybody like we did the last time. How should I think about this as a informed ingenue across the pond?
As you discovered, and as you put very well in your book, the one did indeed grow from the other, right? The Glorious Revolution was experienced by the colonists, and the overthrow of James was an event. There was even, I think, some skirmishing in Maryland between Puritan and Catholics. So this was very much the immediate inheritance of the colonists. And when Madison came to draw up the Bill of Rights, a lot of it was pretty much downloaded. I mean, word for word almost. You didn't have the cut and paste function, obviously, in those days, but it was the right to bear arms and freedom from cruel and unusual punishments and all of this. This was just copied word for word, and quite consciously it would have been recognized by everyone at the time that that's what was being done. But do we need to go further back? I'm really interested in this at the moment. I have just started, of all the unrewarding, or at least financially unrewarding, intellectually hugely stimulating projects, a mammoth study of the history of the Tory party. Of course, that immediately raises the question, where do you start? How far back do these roots go? And it's actually another way of asking the same question, because was it part of the same struggle? Conventionally, the party names came into effect. Tory and Whig came into effect as names around about 1679, 1680 maybe. And the issue was about excluding James II. So if you like, it was a Glorious Revolution division. Could we have a Catholic king? Was there a way of constraining him? Did Parliament have the power to change the succession? All of these basically kind of legal and democratic questions. But I started pulling at that thread, and I found that it was impossible not to start at least at the Civil War, because the two parties and the two sides were so clearly formed during the Civil War, and the number of people who swapped sides was so limited. And by the way, this is equally true of the Tory and Patriot traditions in the colonies at the time. Which side people's ancestors had been on the English Civil War was a really good predictor, or its Scottish or Irish equivalents, really good predictor of whether they would be revolutionaries or whether they'd be loyalists. I mean, you've got to just bite the bullet here. I ended up just plumping for a date when the English party system began. And I plumped for the 22nd of November, 1642, which was the vote on the Grand Remonstrance. The Grand Remonstrance was a series of grievances laid by Parliament against the Crown The beauty of it is that it was polarizing. You had to be either for it or against it. Almost everyone would have agreed with some bits of it, and almost everyone would have disagreed with some bits of it. But as is always the case in politics, in the end, you've got to decide which is the lesser evil. You had to stand up and be counted. By the way, quite literally stand up and be counted, because that was the procedure in those days if it was a close vote, if you couldn't hear by voice which side was the majority. And it was a very close vote. And funnily enough, I realized as I was writing this that I've gone back to what the old Whig historians in the 19th century said, which is these were the two traditions, are still the two traditions in Britain, which of course they were in their day. And I would say that Tory-Whig distinction lasted until the rise of socialism, which pushed the two traditions together and made them bury their differences in the face of something that was very threatening to both. Now, coming back to a difference between the British and American conservative traditions, I would say the American conservative tradition is much more Whig. Whig is...
Yeah, could you take a break for the layman? I mean, I have my own answers to this, but yours are more interesting. Can you explain pre-socialism, difference between a Whig and a Tory, and post-socialism, like what Whiggism becomes?
So I would say pre-socialism, the differences are, first of all, there was a difference of churchmanship. However much you try and get away from this, Whig politicians were generally representative of either the more low church tendency within the Church of England or the dissenting Protestants, the people who, if you like, were more radical, whereas Toryism was more closely associated with the high church tendency in the Church of England and Catholicism, and prior to massive immigration of Catholics from poorer places. But then there was a huge difference of philosophy. Toryism was about hierarchy, about authority, about the proper place of the law and the system, that you had the king, the lords and the commons, and that this was beyond reproach and you couldn't rebel against it. And if you didn't like what it was doing, that was tough. You had to just try and work within the system. The Whig tradition was much more radical, much more in favor of individual liberty, free trade, and also the right of resistance, that if the rulers were not sticking to the understood restrictions on their powers, laid down since Magna Carta, that you had a right, indeed arguably a duty, to rise up and do something about it. And I would say those two traditions, I mean, I've stated them in quite extreme forms.
Sure.
In reality, most people were fairly moderate and could get on fairly well. But I would say that if you'd been in Parliament in the 1670s or 1680s and you'd seen what the Tories and Whigs were, and you were then transported forward in time to the 1880s, you'd seen what the Conservative and Liberal parties were arguing over, you'd have guessed which was which, right? It would have been familiar enough to you, both in terms of the aesthetics and in terms of the philosophy. Now, as the franchise extended, and as socialism took root, and because the one thing that the Tories and Whigs agreed on is, they neither of them imagined a big government in the way that we have now. It would have been unthinkable to both of them to have had this, to have had the state providing healthcare and education and all this kind of stuff. So when the argument moved on to the power and authority of the state, the Tories and the Whigs in Britain found themselves pushed together and eventually merged, actually. I mean, this is often forgotten, but the official name of my party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. The and Unionist bit was added in 1912 when the old Whigs who had been repelled from the Liberal Party as it began its drift towards social democracy, so the old kind of Palmerstonian traditional Whigs of the 18th century kind, they ended up, they sat at first as what was called Liberal Unionists, and then they ended up joining the Tories. And so I would say that our party is now the inheritor to both traditions. Margaret Thatcher very much in the Whig tradition. Her father, I think, was a Liberal councillor. We've never quite been able to establish that, but we think he was. Methodist, provincial, daughter of a shopkeeper, absolutely in the Whig tradition. Whereas, someone like David Cameron, very much in the Tory tradition.
I mean, if someone asked me what your philosophy is, I would be inclined to call you an old Whig, right? I mean, that's what Hayek called himself. That's what Burke called himself. I mean, old Whig has a...
It's good enough for Hayek, Burke, and Jefferson, right? I mean, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Although, funnily enough, as often happens, Jonah, when you write a biography of someone, unless they are a monster, you end up becoming more sympathetic to them. And researching this story of Toryism has made me a little bit more sympathetic, or at least a little bit readier to understand where they were coming from. So let's take the example of the American Tories, i.e. the Loyalists. Really, until very recently, I saw them through patriot eyes as servile, scared, clinging to privileges, unwilling to take the risk of full democracy. And I now realize that I really wasn't listening to what they themselves were saying. Now, on balance, I still disagree with them, right? I'd have still, I think, been on the patriot side in the revolution. But they had a fully worked out philosophy that first of all said, once you tear up the rules, everything becomes unsafe. How is anyone's property secure? How is anyone's life secure if you're making up the rules as you go along? And second, as one of them who was exiled to Canada magnificently put it, I'd rather have one tyrant 1,000 miles away than 1,000 tyrants 1 mile away. In other words, he feared that full democracy would lead to a kind of socialism. Now, on balance, I think that was wrong. I think I would have thought that at the time. But it wasn't. We shouldn't caricature it either. I mean, it was a fully worked out and, by its own lights, fully respectable philosophy, with which, on balance, I disagree. I think I've become a lot more balanced about seeing both the poetry and the sense of the Tory tradition than I was.
Yes, I have a question about that. So I think you're right. I've become more sympathetic of the Loyalists than I once was, but I am still not on the side of the Loyalists. And but one of the points, that Brits will often make, who are less sympathetic to the American Revolution, is that there was a certain amount of hypocrisy going on insofar as the Americans, when they were still, these supposed fighters for democracy or republicanism or whatever the terms we want to use, for self-rule, for power to the people, they were trying to do an end run around Parliament and go straight to and appealing to the king, which is contrary to this old sort of philosophical approach that they ended up imposing here. I mean, they were basically asking the king to overrule Parliament. Like, that is a hard thing to sort of square with some of the...
I think that goes back to the different ways in which the Glorious Revolution was remembered on each side of the Atlantic. So in England, and more widely in Great Britain, it was seen as the absolute vindication of Parliament. And Parliament could then, from then we were basically a crowned republic, and Parliament could lay down the succession and all of that. Whereas I think in the US, from what people were writing at the time, it was seen much more as like a new Magna Carta, a direct grant of rights to the individual. And therefore, it never really occurred to most American colonists that their rights needed in any way to be interpreted or mediated by an elected legislature. Every movement has its inconsistencies and its hypocrisies. Mine does, yours does. We all did. There was the greatest and most eloquent Tory of the time in England during the revolution was Dr. Johnson, who famously dismissed the revolution with his observation: "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty?" The loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of the Negroes. There were all these inconsistencies. There always are. That doesn't invalidate the whole project. Understanding balance and understanding the other side, God knows this needs to be said at the moment, is part of being a fully active citizen and a mature adult, isn't it? I mean, understanding that the people you disagree with are not coming to that position from stupidity or malice is surely the first step towards engaging in politics.
Yeah, and there's also stuff like that people sometimes, what comes to mind is like the 3/5 clause, which said that, blacks would be only counted as 3/5 of a person in the Constitution, and it was part of the compromise about the Constitution. I think it's an evil stain on American history that was in the Constitution, and I'm glad it was done away with. I wish it was never necessary in the first place. But when you try to explain to people that it was the abolitionists who wanted black people to count for zero, and it was the slaveholders who wanted black people to count as a whole human being, because it would boost,
their numbers, right?
It would boost their representation in Congress and give them the stranglehold. And the abolitionists were like, "There's no way you can count slaves as citizens towards your representation when they're slaves." And it makes you realize that
this, by the way, is the ultimate answer to that slightly weird kind of Mises Institute, Confederate nostalgia. I mean, I do get asked this occasionally by Southern American nostalgists, but you're a great sovereignty guy. You were Mr. Brexit, surely you can. I mean, setting aside everything else, none of those secessionist states had a full franchise. If it had done, almost certainly the white unionists and the slaves would have been the majority. So, but do you know one of the things that I'm always fascinated by kind of earlier examples of some of the arguments that we're living through in our time. We've had this whole thing about the symbolism and the obsession with race and obsession with gender and the kind of coming up with. I mean, in Britain, for example, there is constant pressure to pretend that we had a very large non-white population, kind of in Tudor times, which is obviously untrue. But I'm always nothing new is under the sun, as your great ancestor King Solomon says. And look at that picture of Washington crossing the Delaware, right? Everything about that picture is wrong. Everything about it is what we would now call woke. So first of all, he's got the Betsy Ross flag. And that was, Betsy Ross was kind of invented more or less round about the centenary to try and provide a role model for women. He would have actually been, if he had a flag, it would have been the Grand Union flag. Look at who's in the boat with him, right? Who are the ethnicities represented as revolutionaries crossing the Delaware? It's a Native American, a Black American, and a Scottish Highlander, right? The three people that would have been on the other side. Okay, you could probably find one or two, right? Because there's always, the human race is gnarled and twisted. But the overwhelming majority of American Indians, of Black Americans, and of Scots Highlanders, for all the obvious reasons, were loyalists. So what's fascinating to me is that in the mid-19th century, you've got the version of pretending that there were lots of Black Tudors. You've got people already trying to make this argument that, look, it doesn't matter, who your ancestors were, we can all feel part of this thing.
It's funny you mentioned this just because I am more sympathetic to that kind of thing than I used to be. It just has to be done well. Okay, as you know, I'm kind of fascinated by this whole thing about whether or not Western liberalism or even capitalism or all this stuff, the rights-based regime, how much of it is ideological and how much of it is sort of cultural? How much is it just like we're just have a liberal culture that we got from the Brits? Anyway, one of the things we also got from the Brits was a high tolerance for advertising. So let's take a break from our sponsor and then we'll get back to it. So I want to, in the time we have left, I just want to float an idea for you. So one of the things that your book, Inventing Freedom, was very useful for me on was this point about how, first of all, the English are weird. And I mean that in the most loving way possible, which is that they just had this weird attachment to things that would one day, 1,000 years later, start to be called liberalism. Right, or freedom. And there were cultural norms, man's home is his castle, all these kinds of things that over time got turned into principles, but they used to just be sort of quirky cultural norms. And one of the things that bothers me greatly in the current debates about post-liberalism and, whether we need, ultramontane Catholicism to rule America and all this nonsense is, what a lot of the post-liberals don't appreciate is that you could strip all of the theory out of American Whiggishness, liberalism as you and I would call it. And this would just be a liberal culture. Like we American people, in large part because of the English tradition, don't like overweening government. They don't like when someone says, you can't do this. I thought this was America. It is this sort of knee-jerk, as you used to quote all the time, the American, that Tocqueville quote about the American is the Englishman left alone. That part of American culture is just liberal. And you could prove to everybody that John Locke was wrong, and it wouldn't change a thing about Americans' expectations about the role of government and about their own personal autonomy and freedom. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why the Whigs and the Tories end up joining forces is that, and you just correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it feels like the Whigs were more abstract in their love of liberty and freedom. They came out with a proactive formula understanding of things like trade and individualism, while the Tories rested on a tradition of these are our customs. This is what it means to be English. And it turns out the reason they could get along is that the English were already a very liberal people. And so a philosophy of liberalism can glom on to a party of tradition in a country where the tradition is fundamentally liberal. Is that fair?
Yeah. And once again, you put it beautifully. And one of the very striking things is how liberal our conservative parties are in the exact sense of the word liberal, individualist. And one of the reasons that I set out to write this book about the Tories is because I wanted to establish the apostolic succession going right back to 1680, which is important on lots of levels, not least because the Conservative Party, as the Conservatives, under that name, were founded only in 1834. So unless we can claim the Tory prelude, the US Democrats become the oldest party in the world, which I think is,
Which you just can't allow that. Right?
We're all agree we don't want that to happen, right? But the funny thing is you can, and the standard historiography on this is the Tory party kind of, it existed in the late 17th and early 18th century, then it kind of disappeared. It still existed as a tradition. You still had people like Dr. Johnson calling themselves Tories, but there was no organized movement, nothing in Parliament, and then the label was then reattached in the early 19th century to a bunch of other people. Now, I just don't think that's true. And the more I look at the individual, the capacity to do this research now with a combination of AI and kind researchers putting everything online is astonishing. But if you trace through the trajectory of individual MPs during the period when there was supposedly no Tory party, you find that there was an awful lot going on. There was a guy, for me, the most on-brand Tory leader of all. No one has heard it. If you say to anyone in this country, name a Tory leader between, 1730 and Pitt the Younger, they'll all go blank. But there was a guy called Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne, quite apart from his really on-brand name, died breaking his neck while hunting rabbits from horseback, which I think is about as Tory as it comes. And the reason I tell you about Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne is that he, for me, embodies something that is really important in the Tory tradition, which is that politics should never be all-consuming, right? You've got to have a hinterland that goes way, way beyond your ideological interests and your political principles. And I think this was true of most Tories and most Whigs. And I think it was true of most Americans, actually. It was something that it was because, if you like, we'd reached a comfortable place where we knew that if our guys lost the election, it wasn't the end of the world. We weren't going to be locked up. We weren't going to be deported or expropriated. We could afford a sense of perspective about politics, which maybe you couldn't do if you're in Venezuela or Afghanistan or something, right? And I really now, I miss that sense of detachment. 20 years ago, I used to think, why is everyone so uninterested? Why is everyone, so apathetic? I wish that apathy were back. The number of people who get really upset about things, often really emotionally upset about subjects which they haven't really understood, is a terrible kind of side effect of our screen-addled age. And so as a good Whig, but I'd say the same as a good Tory, just chill, just leave the politics alone. Have an opinion, but it's not nearly as immediate as what you're going to have for lunch.
I haven't completely decided this, but I've been inclined to think that a lot of people's rage about politics is, not all of it, to be sure, not all of it, but a lot of it is what Rob Henderson, the sociologist, calls a luxury belief. It is, he wrote this book about, partly memoir, but also about this idea where you go to a lot of these college campuses and you can tell who's rich and who grew up affluent by how much they care about really bespoke, fringe, social justice, woke issues. And the kids who come from immigrant families or blue collar families, first generation kids who go to college, who have to pay their own way or whatever, like really, we're talking about whether men can get pregnant, right? The shibboleths of a lot of the woke stuff are, in fact, sort of tells that show that you come from an elite background. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think the extension of that is that to get really worked up about some of the political issues we face, not all of them, means you've just got a lot of time on your hands. Like it is a hobby in some ways. It's kind of a Veblen good, right? Is like, I can get
I think a lot of the people who get really worked up are not spending any. I say you and I might get really worked up about, whether Madison was preferable to Monroe or something, right? And we'd be aware that we were pursuing a niche interest that we happened to have in common, and we felt strongly about it because it was our interest. The thing that strikes me as damaging our entire kind of public discourse now is people who have only the most superficial knowledge, gained from having looked at one tweet, and yet who then go to volume 10 and feel really intensely about something which they haven't really grasped the fundamentals of at all. And it makes them unhappy, and it also makes politics a much harder business to carry on.
No, that's absolutely true. I think that's true. And that's probably a different phenomenon than what I was talking about, but you're probably right.
I think I don't disagree, by the way, with the luxury beliefs thing. I think that is absolutely true. But it's like that's been the spread of the superficiality of the luxury beliefs. Yeah. And the way in which people then sort of turn on a sixpence on them is extraordinary. And I think that was less true when people were just kind of outdoors more. Do you know what I mean? And alone with their thoughts and reading books instead of screens.
The phrase, which I think originates on the left, but it's right, it's correct nonetheless, of touching grass, right? Of this idea of putting the phone down and just going outside, it touches on something very real. All right, I have been yeoman-like in avoiding anything approaching stuff on the news since I asked you about the free speech stuff. And in the few minutes we got left, this might become dated, but I don't think so. I just wanted to ask you, I have this theory that, if you listen to MAGA people, it is a sign of how Trump is a colossus on the world stage, leading, lesser nations and really in command of the situation. And look, I think in a lot of ways politically he is a colossus and he is the center of attention, and that matters in politics. And there are all sorts of ways in which he is dominant. I don't dispute any of that. But when I watch those world leaders come to the United States on Monday, again, we're recording on August 21st, the hardcore MAGA people want to say, see, they are all sort of subservient to Trump. They're following his lead. And what I see is a bunch of world leaders who have cracked the code about Donald Trump and understand that if you flatter him and you make him feel like he's in charge, you can get him to do what you want to do to some extent. And they wanted to come in and basically stage manage Trump in response to, as a sign of solidarity, not with Trump, but with Zelensky. And I think this is the thing that makes it very difficult to analyze international politics these days, is that all of these world leaders have figured out what the Orbans and the Steve Bannons and the Putins figured out much earlier, which is flatter the guy, tell him, stuff that he wants to hear, and call him daddy or whatever it is. And you can get a lot out of him. And so the public statements from Keir Starmer or Macron or any of these people, it's very difficult for me as an onlooker over here to judge whether or not this is all just an act to manage Trump, or whether in fact he has much more sort of control over these foreign governments than I would otherwise believe. How do you think about it?
No, I'm sure you're right. They will all have ambassadors who say, here, we've been watching him and here are the buttons to press. And, he really is like a 5-year-old child. You have to be this direct with the flattery and all that. Putin worked this out a long time ago. And Putin has been playing that game with all the expertise of a ex-KGB PSYOPs guy. And I have to say, has won. He's played it, as you say, we're recording on the 21st of August. I saw the news this morning that another US-owned business had been hit by Russian missiles in Ukraine, a Texan company called Flex. Does anyone, I'm going to make a prediction here. I don't know when you're going to be listening to this podcast, but I'm pretty sure that by the time you do, Mr. America First will not have, stirred himself to a defense of the national interest and demanded reparations and threatened retaliation, because he never has against Putin. The one constant we've had all the way through is that he's wheedling vis-a-vis Putin and threatening vis-a-vis Ukraine. Now, I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just resentment about the whole Hunter Biden, the cameo role that Zelensky had in his impeachment, or if he genuinely is in some way a Russian asset. I have to say, if he were a Russian asset, it's difficult to see what he would be doing differently from if he's not, right? But one way or another, what really bothers me is that so few Americans are upset by this, that they are all, I totally get the argument for isolationism. I don't share it, but I get it, right? I totally, there is an honorable, perfectly consistent kind of Ron Paul view that would say, look, Vladimir Putin is a shit, but wake me up when he gets to Portland, Oregon, right? I could get on board with that, even though it's not exactly my cup of tea. But this siding with Putin, why does that not bother more people? I just find it utterly bewildering. And I can only put it down to the success of Russian propaganda over many years. That the kinds of people who think of themselves as the smartest, the first to see through state psyops, the most kind of anti-lockdown, the most anti-administrative state, all that, have actually fallen big time for a brilliant bit of work by Putinite agent provocateur.
Yeah, I absolutely believe the propaganda, the Russian, psyop propaganda, active measures, all those things play a significant role. I think at least in America, I cannot speak, and I would suspect that stuff plays an even bigger role in Europe. But in America, I think part of it is that just everything is filtered through this partisan lens to the point where, I've started writing a lot about what I call critical Trump theory, which is sort of using the logic of critical race theory, which says any result that disproportionately negatively impacts a race or gender or whatever is objectively biased or illegitimate, regardless of what the intent was. That's how people view things about Trump, is that if something reflects negatively on Trump, it must be driven by anti-Trump bias and must be objectively wrong. And therefore, anything that is sort of on Trump's side has to be right. And for me, the sort of canary in the coal mine about this was 10 years ago when Hillary was making a big deal about Russia, whatever, and all that stuff. And there were these T-shirts going around with these guys saying, I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat. And these were like middle-aged right-wing guys. And the idea that you would turn over the pyramid of our foreign policy, history and understandings of right and wrong going back a long, long time to simply say that the Democrats are so bad, that you're going to side with Russia, this barbaric, regime and adversary. That sort of me was sort of a tell of where this is kind of going. I think because Trump likes Putin, I think he's got a 1980s nostalgia that says that it makes him a big deal that he gets along well with the head of Russia. You hear it when he talks about how nuclear is so important. And because Trump has created a climate of kowtowing to him, a lot of people just put on the back burner their reasoning and cognitive abilities when it comes to foreign policy. It's infuriating. I agree with you entirely on that.
This is going to end very badly. I mean, I saw your most recent piece about this, which of course I completely agreed with, where you made the brilliant point that although Trump loses no opportunity to remind us, or to claim at least, that the war wouldn't have started if he'd been president, the war has sure intensified while he's been president. And the reason for that is that Putin is playing him. And I'm pretty sure that for all that you were saying about all the European leaders knowing what buttons to press, I'm pretty sure that Putin will end up making demands that he knows to be completely unacceptable. For example, this territorial swap between highly fortified Ukrainian frontline territory and stuff that he doesn't really own, right? I think he'll probably demand a different government to talk to in Ukraine and all of that. He'll make a whole series of demands. And he'll do that because he expects most, as well as legitimizing all the pro-Russian parties in Ukraine and all that. I think he'll do that, and he'll expect, on the basis of experience, Trump to back him. And I think Trump will back him. And this is just what I find so weird about the people you were describing with your critical Trump theory.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole shtick that you get from these guys is, well, at least he knows how to own the other side. He's a tough guy, and yet here he is being slapped in the most humiliating way, saying, please, Vladimir, stop. Oh, you've dropped another missile. Well, please don't do it again. Oh, no, another. Oh, well, please don't do it this time. He's put forward all these plans and Putin has just rejected them. And yet he keeps coming back for more. And that doesn't do anything to dent the adulation of his cheerleaders.
Yeah, I agree. It's very depressing. All right, Daniel Hannan, thank you again for coming on. You're always welcome to come on. You have an open invitation to come back to the Remnant, and you might as well be the Remnant chapter head of the UK. How few of us there are left.
I feel like a remnant in many, many ways. Funnily enough, I'm speaking to you from my house in Hampshire. The nearest hereditary peer who lives about a mile from me here. All the last remaining hereditaries are being cleared out. And I was really hoping that this guy would be the last because his name is Lord Remnant. And I just thought that would have been so apt. So I might suggest to him that he come on your show, have a Remnant on Remnant.
That is fantastic. Okay, Daniel Hannan has left the studio, and in point of fact, so have I, because I'm recording this conclusion like a week later. And I will tell you, one of the things that has been driving me crazy that I meant to ask him about, actually meant to ask him about two things. One was this thing about British naval culture and the Royal Navy as a Protestant institution thing, and a defender of liberty thing, which anyway, I talked about this before. I think it's a really interesting topic. I have ideas. I don't want to lay them all out here because if I do this book, it's for that. So, but the other thing I wanted to ask him about was the Norman yoke. It's weird. Like, when you learn a word for the first time, you start seeing it all over the place and you're like, how did it hide and play inside all this time? A couple months ago, I started hearing references to how the Norman yoke really is the part of the Anglo tradition that influences the American tradition for its sort of knee-jerk opposition to tyranny. And that the sort of paranoid style is really just sort of the long tail of the Norman yoke in England. And of course, the Norman yoke is when the Normans invaded, and we don't have to do 1066 and all that, and conquered the English, kind of Frenchified it, put all those doublets into the legal language, which we've talked about before. And anyway, it's been part of like the English culture to sort of be wary of the state ever since, although it seems like it is declining now. And I meant to ask Daniel about it and I didn't. So we will be returning to this anon. And anyway, it's always great to have Daniel Hannan on the podcast. And I don't have to read the Suits script anymore, but I do need you guys to help me out here. If you're at all inclined to subscribe to the Dispatch, and I really wish you would be, I'm getting a lot of notes from people saying, hey, I just don't read stuff much. And if I signed up for the Dispatch, that means I would feel obliged to read all of it, or I'd feel like I'm wasting my money and blah, 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 blah. And then, several people have said, but, if you charge for the Remnant, I'd probably pay for it. That's just how I am. And I'm like, okay, well, let's just pretend that we're charging you for the Remnant and the Dispatch podcast and advisory opinions, and we're giving away all the great stuff from Kevin Williamson and Nick Catoggio and Scott Lincecum on the website and in the newsletters for free. It's not that hard of a fiction to keep in mind. But regardless, it helps us do what we're doing. If you do subscribe to the Dispatch, you can listen to these podcasts ad-free. But more importantly, if you sign up, if you go to thedispatch.com/join, promo code REMNANT. That's promo code REMNANT. And if more people do it with promo code REMNANT, than with whatever silly words they use for the advisory opinion ones of the Dispatch podcast, then I will be able to lord it over and taunt my colleagues for a very, very, very long time. Forget all this flagship talk. I just want to win. I want to win fair and square. I also want you guys to start subscribing to the Dispatch because I think you should. I know it'd be good for us. I know it'd be good for you. I know it'd be good for the country. I know it'd be good for all sorts of things. It would be good for my dogs and my cat. And so go to thedispatch.com/join, promo code remnant. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.